Okay, good evening. We're learning Maseches Pesachim Daf Yud Aleph. We're starting on the bottom of Yud Amud Beis at a new Mishnah. This is a Mishnah that we are somewhat familiar with. It was quoted already once in the Masechta, and it speaks about the various times at which one has an obligation or an opportunity, maybe, to do the mitzvah of B'dikas Chametz. We all know, of course, from the first Mishnah in the Masechta, or L'Arba Asar, we should be doing B'dikas Chametz on the night of the 14th. But what happens if you forget? And according to one Havamin in the Gemara, maybe we have a burden to do B'dikas Chametz more than once. Let's get started. Bottom of Yud Amud Beis at the Mishnah, 10 lines from the bottom. The Mishnah opens, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Bodkin or Yud Daled, you should do B'dikas Chametz on the night of the 14th, Uva Yud Daled Shachris, and seemingly, and a double, two, on the morning of the 14th. Uveshas habir, and seemingly a third time, the Havamin of the Gemara is that we have, according to Rabbi Yehuda, that we do B'dikas Chametz 3 times, the night, the morning, and right by Biur Chametz. V'chachamim omrim, lo badak or yodaled yivdok b'yodaled. He seems to say, if you didn't do the night, then of course you should add the morning. Of course, yivdok b'yodaled in the morning. Lo badak b'yodaled. If you don't do B'dikas Chametz in the morning of the 14th, then Yivdok B'soch HaMoed. You should check within the Moed. Not simple language. Machlokes Rashi Tosfos. We're going to get to that in a minute. Lo Yivdok B'soch HaMoed, Yivdok La'achar HaMoed. So again, the Havamin of the Gemara of the Mishnah is that Rabbi Yehuda is saying we have to do a triple B'dika. We have to do on the night of the 14th, the day of the 14th, right when you wake up, and also by Shas Biur. And the Chachamim seem to say, no, you only do the morning if you miss the night. You only do the Biur if you miss the morning. So we just have to take a quick look at Rashi, because in the sheets of the Chachamim that we saw, the language that the Mishnah uses is that Lo badak b'yodaled yivdok b'soch hamoed. What does that mean? Yivdok b'soch hamoed. So take a look at Rashi at the opening of the Mishnah. The Rashi here is 1/3 of the way down by the Masnisen. Dibur hamaschel b'soch hamoed. B'shas shishis shehu moed habiur. That's what he's saying. If you didn't do it during the day, then you do it b'shas biur. That's what's called b'soch moed. And what's la'achar moed? La'achar moed is after the time of Isser Achila already kicks in. Here's what Rashi says, Mishe shos u'lamala ad shetechshach. Now you have a real Isser d'oraisa of eating. So Rabbi Yehuda doesn't allow for B'dikas Chametz after Sheish shos u'lamala. Masha'enken, the Chachamim are more lenient, and we're going to dig into that heavily today. So the last line of the Mishnah, and then we will start with the Gemara. The last line of the Mishnah reads, whatever chametz you have left over after b'dikas chametz, yinichenu b'tzina, you should put it in a box, you should hide it. This is a line that we saw earlier that made us question our own Mishnah on Daf Beis. Let us get started with the Gemara here with a deep analysis of the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. Says the Gemara, my time of Rabbi Yehuda. What is the reason of Rabbi Yehuda? Again, the Havamina is that Rabbi Yehuda requires that there's 3 B'dikos. There's the night of the 14th, the morning of the 14th, and Shas Biur. My time of Rabbi Yehuda, says the Gemara in the name of 2 Amoraim, Rav Chizda v'Rabba bar Rav Huna de Amri Tarvaihu. Both of them said the following, Keneged Shalosh Hashbasos Shebatorah, from the word Tashbisu, the Hashbis. There are 3 times that the Torah tells us to destroy chametz. How do they work out? Then number 1, Lo Yera'elecha Chametz V'lo Yera'elecha Seor, that's pasuk number 1. Pasuk number 2, Shivas Yamim Sor Le'matzi Bevatechem. You should not have any chametz in your house. Pasuk number 3, Ach B'yom Harishon Tashbis Sor Me'Batechem. So again, having in the Gemara that you do 3 b'dikos and psukim to boot. Makes perfect sense. Says the Gemara, a double question, really the same question, just asked by 2 different sources with slight variations. The problem is that you're learning Rabbi Yehuda that he says you have to do 3 b'dikos, but elsewhere Rabbi Yehuda doesn't say that. Let's see what the elsewhere is. So says the Gemara, we're 5 lines from the bottom end of the line. Masiv Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef was an Amora, 3rd century of the Amorim. He asks the following. He says, I have a brisa that says as follows. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Kol Shalo Badak Bishlosha Prakim Halalu Shuveno Bodek. Someone who doesn't do bdika in one of these 3 times, then Eno Bodek. Alma, what does it seem from this brisa about Rabbi Yehuda? It seems Mikan ve'elechu de pligi. It implies that we're only really talking about what happens after the Shas Biur. Are we allowed to do b'dika later? That's what it seems like from the language of shuv eino yachol. What's the language? It's shuv eino bodek, that he's not able to do the b'dika anymore. So this brisa gives a flavor of Rabbi Yehuda that it's not about needing to do 3. It's about making sure that you do it in time so that you don't get stuck with not being able to do the mitzvah b'dika. And it says the Gemara, another version of this question, Mar Zutra Masni Hachi, he said that the brisa was a little different. Masiv Rav Yosef, Mar Zutra, of course, lived later. He's quoting Rav Yosef's question. He says the brisa that Rav Yosef quoted was different. Rav Yehuda Omer, Kol shelo badak, get the language here. The echad mishlosha prakim halalu, more explicit. If you didn't do any one of these three, so then you're stuck. Shuv eno bodek. Alma, what do we see from here? We see from this language of Yehuda, b'shuv eno bodek hu depligi. What are they arguing about? About when you're no longer allowed to do b'dikas chametz. Let me ask this question in a different way. Does the mitzvah of b'dikas chametz have an expiration date? Is there a do b'dika by time X? So according to Yehuda, yes. By the time you get to Shas Biur, you could no longer do b'dikas chametz. That's it. You're done. Once you're past the 6th hour, the mitzvah derabanan has dissolved. You can't make a bracha on it. You're not allowed. You're done. You're done. The mitzvah's over. You're done. However, seemingly, Rabbi Yehuda would be the strict opinion, and the Chachamim would say you're even allowed to do so after the 6th hour. So says the Gemara, Ella, you're right. We thought our Havamina was like Rav Chizda and Rabbi Bar Rav Huna, that you have to do 3 bedikos. That's what we thought in Rabbi Yehuda. We conclude that no, Rabbi Yehuda really holds that it's just any one of those 3, but that once you get to Shas Biur, that's your last opportunity here, last stop on the train. If you choose, or for whatever reason you don't do bedika by that time, you can no longer do bedika. Why? Why does Rabbi Yehuda have this limitation? 3 lines from the bottom. Rabbi Yehuda, it's correct. Rabbi Yehuda Nami, he agrees to the Chachamim that im lo badak ka'amar. If you didn't do the night, then you should do the morning. If you didn't do the morning, then you should do the afternoon by biur or the morning by biur. The hacha here, what is Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim arguing about? Mar savar mekame isura in basar isura lo. Once we get to the point where there's shas isur of chametz, you've lost the right to do the mitzvah of b'dikas chametz. Gzeira, what's the concern? Why does Rabbi Yehuda not allow for b'dikas chametz later? Because dilma asi lemechal mine. We're afraid that you may find chametz during the b'dika process after shas chametz of isur. Now it's the 7th hour. Now we're done. You find some really gishmak. So we're concerned, says Rabbi Yehuda. I'm not allowing the gzeira. I'm making a gzeira. I'm not allowing b'dikas chametz after the shas isur of chametz. I'm afraid you might come to eat it. V'Rabbanan savre lo gazrinan. They're not concerned. So let's just pause. What is our Mishnah discussing here? It's very simple. I know it's a little convoluted in the language because we would really have to spend time in the Rishonim. If you're saying that Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim are not arguing about the timing of night, and if you miss the night, then morning, and if you miss the morning, then biur. Why is it phrased this way? Great question. Not for now. But what we definitely know is that the machlokas between them is whether or not there's a prohibition, as it were, a gzeira, to not do b'dikas chametz after the shas isur of chametz. Rabbi Yehuda is of the concern that if you do b'dikas chametz at, let's say, the 8th hour of the day, when it's an isur d'oraisa to eat chametz, I'm afraid you may come to eat it. And the Rabbanan say that there is no such gzeira. Good. That's the machlokes in our Mishnah. 2 lines from the bottom. Umi gaza Rabbi Yehuda dilma asi lemechal mineh. Is it really true that Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that we have a gzeira d'Rabbanan about food that I might eat? Well, I can give you a case where Rabbi Yehuda should have said that we have a gzeira that you're not allowed to do X because we're afraid that you might eat, but he failed to do so. Says the Gemara, bottom line, v'hatznan. We know that in the times of the Beis HaMikdash, Mir Hashem should be rebuilt soon, that the Korban Omer was brought. And prior to that time, all the wheat that was there was considered chadash. Chadash is asur min Torah. New grains are not allowed to be eaten in the times of the Mikdash until the Hakrava Sa'omer. And after the Hakrava, then all of the grain becomes yashan. That's what we say. Like if we go to the bakeries, it'll say a yashan bakery. Most of them are yashan. Then in those cases, that's when it's permissible. The big discussion in the poskim, does yashan apply nowadays? Does chadash apply nowadays? Big discussion. What to talk about? Good discussion. Ask your local Orthodox rabbi about that. A big and important discussion. So where do we see that this breaks Rabbi Yehuda's rule that we have a gzeira? So here's where the rule gets all messed up. Tanan, the Mishnah writes, Misha Karav HaOmer, on the day, Rashi adds in the words here, on the day, Bo Bayom, on the day that the Hakravas HaOmer would take place, on that day in the marketplace, Yotzin Umotzi and Shuke Yerushalayim Shehin Malayin Kemach V'Keli. Even before the Hakravas HaOmer, people would fill up the marketplace with the new wheat. It wasn't mutter yet because the Hakrava hadn't taken place yet. The Korban Omer wasn't brought yet. But by the time that they got to the flea market, there were just bales and bales and bales of wheat and grain ready to be sold. So says the Gemara, they were Malayin Kemach V'Keli. As we turn to the top of Yud Aleph, Amud Aleph, says the Gemara, Shelo b'ratzon chachamim divrei Rav Meir. Rav Meir was of the opinion that you're not allowed to do that. Why? Because before the Hakrava of the Omer, before the Korban Omer is brought, that food is chadash. What's our concern? You might eat it. Rabbi Yehuda didn't say that. Who said that? Rav Meir. What does Rabbi Yehuda say? Rabbi Yehuda Omer, no, they did fine. V'ratzon chachamim hayu osin. It says the Gemara, v'lo kagazer Rabbi Yehuda del ma'asi l'meichal minei. You just said in our Mishnah that we were concerned about doing B'dika after the 6th hour because maybe Dilma Asi L'meichal Minei. Well, if Rabbi Yehuda was concerned about that by Chametz, why is he not concerned about that as it relates to Chadash prior to the Hakravas HaOmer? Why wasn't he concerned of Dilma Asi L'meichal Minei? You're going to go in the marketplace, you're going to take food that seems to be ready to eat, but the Hakravas HaOmer hasn't taken place. Contradiction within Rabbi Yehuda. Because in our Mishnah, he says we have a concern about maybe you'll eat it. But by Chadash, he says we're not concerned about maybe you'll eat it. Why the distinction? Answers the Gemara 4 lines down, Yud Aleph Amud Aleph. Amar Rava, shiny Chadash. Chadash is different. It says, why is Chadash different than our Mishnah? Mitoch shelo lo hitarta lo ela al yedei kituv hu zachor. Because when one is going to harvest these grains prior to the Hakravas HaOmer, they're tearing it out with their hands. You cannot use a sickle. You got to tear it out with your brush. He explains this. You have to tear it out barehanded. So therefore, Zachor, you're going to remember not to buy it. Okay, that's good. That's helpful. Amar le Abaye. Well, okay. Teinach b'shas ktifa. That's helpful if you're tearing it off barehanded. Fine, that's good. But what about the next phase of processing the wheat? Tchina v'harkada ma'ikol meimar. What about grinding it and what about sifting it? Again, you want to tell me that you're plucking it out of the ground and it's a unique way to pluck it out of the ground. So that's fine. There's something unique about it. But grinding is grinding and sifting is sifting. Says the Gemara, Halo kasha, tchina v'rachya diyad. You're not doing regular grinding. You're using a hand grinder, which is like a shinui of sorts. And harkada al gabe napa. Here, we're using the sifter, but in like an upside down way. Good, you answered the question. So maybe we can say that chadash is different. Fine, maybe that's a distinction to be made. Asks the Gemara, hold on one second, and this is gonna burst the bubble for this answer. But wait a minute, we have a Mishnah elsewhere that writes, Kotzrin, we harvest with a sickle, with a blade. Kotzrin beis hashalchaim be'amakim. There are places, they're not great places to harvest, but nevertheless, one is allowed to cut there directly with a blade. Avalo godshin, and you're not allowed to make piles out of it. Ve'ukimna, what do we say about that Mishnah that says that you can harvest with a sickle? Ve'ukimna Rabbi Yehuda, we hold like Rabbi Yehuda, who says that it's not a problem. Ma'ikol meimar. There we have a real contradiction between Chadash and our Mishnah. Because in this Mishnah, you're cutting with a sickle, you're cutting with a blade. That's the world of Chadash. And Rabbi Yehuda says it's mutter. So that means that by Chadash, you're cutting without a shinu, you're cutting, and Rabbi Yehuda is not concerned about eating. But in our Mishnah, he is concerned. How do we answer that question? Says the Gemara, and this is going to guide us until the Mishnah on the next page. Elo Amar Abaye, Chadash badil minei. Chametz lo badil minei. Chadash is something that is infrequent. Literally, badil minei means that we separate from it. We know Chadash is totally usher for long stretches of time. We're badil minei. We're accustomed to not being involved with not eating Chadash. But Chametz, we eat Chametz all year round. So that's the distinction the Gemara made. So now let's answer the question. Rabbi Yehuda, stira. By Chametz, he has a gzera. By Chadash, he doesn't have a gzera. Answers the Gemara, we need the gzera by chametz because you eat chametz all year round. So you're going to be doing bedika after the 6th hour, after the 7th hour. You're going to find some good chewy cookies. We're concerned because you're low badil. You never really separate from chametz. There you need gzera. But by chadash, which has a longer stretch of lack of access to the food, in such a case we would then say we don't need gzera. Good. Says the Gemara 10 lines down. Amar Abaye. To Rabbi Yehuda kasha. All right, you asked the question about Rabbi Yehuda on Rabbi Yehuda. What about derabanan ad derabanan lo kasha? Isn't that also a stira? What did our Mishnah say in the Rabbanan? Remember the second to last line on the page said v'Rabbanan savre lo gazrinan. In our Mishnah, the rabbi said there's no concern that you may come to eat food after the 7th hour, which is why the Chachamim allow you to do bdikas chametz into the 7th and 8th hour. We don't care. It's no problem. Even though there's an Isser Doraisi chametz, then we're not concerned. But what did they say in the Mishnah by Chadash? They said, Shelo b'ratzon chachamim. It's in the name of Rav Meir. And here's an important piece of information. Our Mishnah, Stam Mishnah Kerav Meir. That's what we typically assume. When a Mishnah is authorless, it's an anonymous Mishnah, we assume it's Rav Meir. So what that means is that our Mishnah is Rav Meir, and he says no gzera. Yet by Chadash, he says, Shelo b'ratzon chachamim, that there is a gzera. So it's a derabanan ad derabanan lo kasha. Of course it's a question. So it says the Gemara, let's answer both. We already answered one. The stira that we had between Rav Yehuda in our Mishnah by Chametz and Rav Yehuda in the Mishnah at the top of the page by Chadash, that we answered Kiddush Shaninan, like we taught above. the answer of Abaye, that chadash, we are more accustomed to not eating chadash, so we don't need gzeira there, but we do by chametz. However, derabbanan nami lo kasha. How do the Rabbanan, how does Rav Meir get out of this stira that in our Mishnah there's no gzeira, and by chadash there is a gzeira? Who atzmo mechazer alav l'sorfo. He gives a psychology. Today's going to have two major psychological gemaras. This is number one. What does Rav Meir say? You're walking around your house with a brown paper bag to go pick up some chametz. You've got your candle, you've got your feather, you got your kid's project, whatever it is. What he says, who atzmo mechazer alav l'sorfo. You're walking around the house to go find chametz to burn it. Meichal kol chil minei. You're in a place where you're going to eat it. Like, it's just so unreasonable. Like, why would I need a gzeira there? So really, the pshat in Rav Meir is like this. Really, we should have a gzeira by food, but by chametz, we don't need it. Because what's the whole essence of b'dikas chametz? Burn it. That's why the bracha is al biur chametz. It's not finding it, it's burning it. So says the Gemara, there's no steer with Rav Meir. The Mishnah, he doesn't need a gzeira by chametz. Because someone who's doing b'dikas chametz is not going to say, oh, b'dikas chametz, I'm going to burn it. I found a cookie. Well, maybe not. Borei minei mizonos. No way. No way. So that's how we solve the stira between our Mishnah with the Rabbanan, who are lenient with no gzeira, and the Mishnah by Chadash, where the rabbis do require it. Rav Ashi wanted to give a second answer. We're about a third of the way down on Yud Aleph Amud Aleph. Rav Ashi wanted to give another answer to the Rav Yehuda stira. Remember, Rav Yehuda in our Mishnah said we need a gzeira. By Chadash, he said no gzeira. Rav Ashi Amar, Rav Yehuda ad Rav Yehuda lo kasha. There's also no question. Here's his answer number 2. We'll get rejected momentarily. Kemach v'kali tanam. We're talking about flour that's in an inedible phase. So says the Gemara, absolutely not. How would this answer the question anyways? It would answer the question by saying that, yes, really in theory, Rav Yehuda would require Gzeira by Chadash too, but in this case, we're making a new Kimta. We're establishing this Mishnah of Chadash as being unique, which says that the Chadash that this Mishnah is talking about, where they put the food out in the flea market in Yerushalayim, that was inedible food. That's how the Gemara would answer. So says the Gemara about Rav Ashi's answer, Ha de Rav Ashi bedusahi. This is not a serious answer. Ha tenach, I could understand if you tell me, if the food is in an inedible state, it's roasted already, it's not really edible yet at this phase. But what about the initial process where it was more edible? Meikara ad kali, from the beginning of its processing until it's toasted. Ma'ikala meimar. What answer do you have, Rav Ashi, to say that it wasn't edible? Because maybe they didn't process it all. Not only that, if you want to give me the same answers that we said above, that what makes this chadash unique, what makes this grain unique in the Mishnah at the top of the page is that it's al yudei kituv k'de Rava. It was the answer that Rava gave, that we're not cutting it with a sickle, we're bare hand yanking out the grains from the ground. Ella kotzrin, what are you going to do about the next source? What about the source that says that you're cutting it with the sickle with something sharp? Ella kotzrin beis hashlachin v'shebe amakin v'ukimna ki Rav Yehuda. In that case of the kotzrin, there we said it was like Rav Yehuda, that there was no gzeira. So Ma'ikal Ameimar, Rav Ashi, how can you possibly circumvent this challenging question? It says the Gemara, you're right. Ella de Rav Ashi bedusahi. It is in fact correct that we reject the answer of Rav Ashi. We fall back to our first answer, the strong answer of Abaye, which is that there's a fundamental difference between Chadash and Chametz. That Chadash is something that we're used to separating from because nobody ate the grains until the Hakravas HaOmer. And Chametz is something that we never separate from. And therefore we need a Gzeira by Chametz, which we never separate from, that you cannot do B'dika after the 7th hour, in the 7th hour, because then we're afraid you might come eat it. Okay, good. Next, we're halfway down on Yud Aleph Amud Aleph. Says the Gemara. We said above in the name of Abaye, explaining Rav Yehuda, we said a principle that where you're not badil mineh, like by chametz, like our Mishnah is a case of lo badil mineh, we're never away from chametz except for 8 days a year, right? Except for people who don't eat any gluten at all. They're a little bit better, fine. But for people who are eating your regular diet, as it were, so then we should have a gzeira in all those cases because it's lo badil mineh. We're never separate from those foods. We're always connected. So asks the Gemara halfway down, in every scenario where we are not distant, where we don't separate from a food like chametz, is it correct that mi gazer Rav Yehuda? Would Rav Yehuda be gozer in all of those cases? I can show you an example where he wasn't gozer. Says the Gemara, v'hatnan, a famous Mishnah, we read it every Friday night. Not only do we read it Friday night, but we learned it in depth in Maseches Shabbos a couple of hundred blot ago at this point. V'hatnan, the Mishnah writes, lo yikov adam shifoferes shel beitza. Let's say that you take the hull of an eggshell. Okay, you cut it at the top and you drain out everything out. And now it just has a tiny little pierced hole at the bottom and it's wide open at the top. You pour in oil, and the oil, because of the size of the hole, has a slow drip out of the eggshell, and it drips into a container that has a wick that's lit. So it's basically a way to create continuous light, right? You have some oil in an egg with a little pierce in the bottom. It's dripping into the candelabra where the wick is lit, and every minute or so it adds another droplet, whatever it is, or whatever the rate of flow is, and that will hopefully help to keep the light lit for a longer period of time. So it says the Gemara, let's analyze this case because we're going to see it may contradict Rabbi Yehuda. So in this case where you fill up the egg with oil, v'malena shemen, and you fill it with oil, the you put it right next to a candle so that so that the oil in the egg will drip into the container in which the candle's actually lit. Even if it's made out of pottery, which is very difficult to clean, the Tanakama holds that how did the Mishnah start? Lo yikov. You're not allowed to do that. Why did he say that? Because as Rashi highlights, there's a gzeira derabanan that we're afraid that you may be mistapik from the oil, that you may use some of the oil for your own purposes, and that will impact how long the candle will stay lit. You're not allowed to do that. You can't continue a fire, and you cannot start a fire. So we can't change that pace once it's there. So the Tanakhama held lo yikov adam shaval version, not allowed to do that. What does Rabbi Yehuda say? Last of the short lines. Rabbi Yehuda matir, no gzeira. Why is there no gzeira? This is something that's lo badil minei. We're never away from candles, especially in their climate. They had no electricity. They were dealing with candles all the time, and certainly they did so every Friday night. So I don't understand. I thought that we said that just like by chametz, how do we distinguish between chadash and chametz? We said that by chametz we're never not exposed to chametz. Okay, but candles were never not exposed to candles. So why doesn't Rabbi Yehuda have a gzeira here? He had one by chametz. Should have one here too. So answers the Gemara, last of the short lines, Hasam mishum chumra de Shabbos mivdal dilei. By Shabbos, people are going to distance themselves from the Isser. You're right. In theory, it would have made sense that Rabbi Yehuda would have a gzeira here, but we didn't need one because there's an ace up the sleeve. What's the ace up the sleeve? People are so concerned about violating Shabbos that we don't need the gzeira derabanan in this case. We allow the egg that's filled with oil to drip into the container to allow the candle to last longer. Not a problem. Maybe you'd come to take the oil. You won't come to take the oil. It's Shabbos. We don't mess with skila. You're not going to touch it. It's going to be fine. So that's how the Gemara answers that. First in the long lines, the Gemara says, but within the halachos of Shabbos, he wasn't consistent either. You're telling me here of Rabbi Yehuda Matir, there was no gzeira derabanan by the case of the dripping into the oil. But what about the next case? V'rami de Shabbos ha-Shabbos. We have a contradiction within the laws of Shabbos itself. How so? Titania, we have a brisa, chevel dlisha nifsak. Let's say that you have a bucket that goes into a well, and the rope holding that bucket breaks. Lo yehe koshro ela onvo. The Tanakhama says you can't tie a knot, but you can tie a bow. Totally appropriate to tie a bow, like the bow that we tie in our shoes. Okay. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, nope, you're not allowed to tie a bow. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, korechala pundia o psakia. These are garments. You cannot tie a regular rope. You cannot tie a bow. You have to tie it with a garment. Ubilvad shelo anvenu, and he doesn't allow for the tying of a bow. Now we can already see our question. Does he have a gzeira there? Is that a gzeira derabanan that you can't tie with a bow, which would be a stira, because by Hilchos Shabbos with the dripping oil, there was no gzeira. Why here are you not allowing the bow? So it says the Gemara, third line of the wide lines, Kasha de Rabbi Yehuda ad Rabbi Yehuda, that's a stira within Rabbi Yehuda, and Kasha de Rabbanan ad Rabbanan, because this case of the rope that broke, Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim reversed their trends from what the halacha was in the case of the dripping oil. In the dripping oil, the Chachamim had a gzeira, and Rabbi Yehuda did not. Here, the Chachamim have no gzeira, and Rabbi Yehuda seemingly doesn't allow to tie the bow. So then the Gemara has to answer this double stira, and answers the Gemara as follows. End of the third wide line. Derabanan derabanan lo kasha. Why is it that the rabbis had a gzeira derabanan in the case of the dripping oil? Because shemen b'shemen michlaf. What we were concerned about is that I may see that oil and want to utilize it for my meal, gross as that may be. But at least they were both the same product. It's oil dripping out of it's oil for the candle, and I need oil for my meal. However, when it comes to tying knots, they didn't need a gzeira. Why? Because, says the Gemara, aniva b'kshira lo michlav. Tying a bow and tying a real knot, no one's ever gonna make that error. It's like tying a slip knot. If you know how to tie a slip knot, everybody knows that knot's coming undone. You just pull hard enough, the knot's gonna come out. So he says there's no need for a gzeira in this case. It's not gonna lead to anything problematic. Very good. Now, what about the other stira between the two Shabbos brises? It was Rabbi Yehuda's issue. What was Rabbi Yehuda's issue? That Rabbi Yehuda held that there was no gzera in regards to the dripping oil lamp, but there seemingly was a gzera that we could not tie a bow. So it says the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda lo kasha. There too, there wasn't a problem. Time of Rabbi Yehuda, the reason why Rabbi Yehuda didn't allow for the tying of a bow, and we've seen this shita before, Lav mishum de gazar aniva atu kshira. It wasn't because of a gzera derabanan that we're afraid that maybe tying a bow is similar to tying a real knot. That wasn't the problem. What was the problem? Ela mishum de kasavar aniva gufa kshirahi. He assumed that tying a regular bow, like our shoe ties, the way we tie them, bunny ears, he held that was mamish a kesher shel kayama. That was a full, all-out knot in halachic terms, and you could violate an iser daraisa by tying a bow. So the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda were arguing about something different when it came to the bow. The Chachamim held that tying a bow is a deviant form of a knot, and you cannot violate the malacha of kosher on Shabbos by tying a bow. However, Rabbi Yehuda said there's no gzeira by a bow. It's an iser daraisa to tie a bow. You're not allowed to do that. Okay, so that's not a contradiction. The reason why here he didn't allow for the bow is because it's an iser daraisa, not because he was gozer midrabanan. There was no rabbinic decree, and therefore no contradiction. Says the Gemara, okay, but there's another layer of contradiction here. The Rami Rabbanan ad Rabbanan. The rabbis have an internal contradiction. How do they have a contradiction? Because within the not sugyas, what did the rabbis say? You can tie a bow. Yet here we have another Mishnah, 5-6 lines from the bottom. Says the Mishnah, Ditznan, kosher dli bipsakya avalo bechevel. You are allowed to tie, again, that bucket that's separated from the rope. You're allowed to tie the bucket with a psaki. It was a garment that women wore. It was, I guess, like a leggings of some kind. The before Shemir on the side said it was worn on like their legs. So the Gemara says there, in the name of the Tanakama, you are allowed to tie the garment with a psakia, with the garment of a lo bechevel, with not with a rope. What does Rabbi Yehuda say? Rabbi Yehuda matir. So the Gemara says, hold on, we need to learn a little bit what's going on. Of course, you can't tie a knot with a chevel because that's an isur d'oraisa. So it says the Gemara, chevel demai, ilema chevel de alma. If what this mission is talking about is just stam, a regular rope, Rabbi Yehuda matir, how could anyone in their right mind allow the tying of a knot? For sure, that's going to be an isur d'oraisa. Kesher shel kayamahu. This is the language of the Gemara that indicates you're making a real knot. Of course, that's going to be usur. Not only that, if you tie this bucket on Shabbos with that rope, you're never going to untie it. And says the Gemara to this effect, Tivade asi liv tule. We're going to let that rope literally be nullified, just become a part of the landscape. It's just going to become the rope that's attached to the bucket. You'll never untie it. In which case, you mamish violated isur d'oraisa tying a knot. Of course, this Mishnah that says that the Chachamim say you can use a psakia, the garment, but not a rope, of course, it's not talking about a regular rope. It has to be talking about something else. So therefore, says the Gemara, elapshita de gardi. Rather, it's obvious that what was this Mishnah talking about? Where the Chachamim said, aval lo bechevel, they said you cannot tie with a rope. That's talking about a gardi. The Gemara explains that a gardi, well, I should say the Mefarshim explain a gardi is a weaver's rope. It's a specialized rope. It has a primary purpose, and it's not to hold up buckets. It's used in a weave. So says the Gemara, what did the Mishnah say? Line 5 from the bottom. They said about lo bechevel. The Chachamim said you're not allowed to use a rope. The gazu rabbanan chevel de gardia to chevel de alma. So we have a contradiction between the Rabbanan. Why? Because initially we saw that the rabbi is allowed to use a bow, lenient. And now we're seeing the rabbis say you cannot use the rope that belongs to a gardi, a weaver's rope. Strict. Contradiction between the Rabbanan. One's lenient, one's strict. Says the Gemara in. And here's the reason why. But not to be confused because it's a good answer. Chevel bechevel nichla. Why were they strict in our case of the chevel, which is a gardi, which was a weaver's rope? Because it looks very similar to the regular rope. And because a regular rope and the gardi, the weaver's rope, are so similar, so therefore we needed to make a gzera d'Rabbanan. However, 3 lines from the bottom, aniva bikshira lo michlafa. There, we're not going to have a contradiction. We're not going to get confused between a regular bow and a permanent knot. 3 lines from the bottom. Lo gaza Rabbi Yehuda. We said on the top of the page in the name of Abaye, explaining Rabbi Yehuda that where something is badil mine, where I really infrequently have access to something. The case we had at the top of the page was by Chadash, where we have a significant amount of time where we're not allowed to access Chadash because the Hakravas Omer, the Korban Omer, was not brought. So then we didn't need a Gzeira. Really? I can give you an example, says the Gemara, of something which is infrequently used, but we have a gzeira. Let's see what the case is. Says the Gemara, we have a brisa that seems to show that he does have a gzeira. Bechor, you have an animal that is meant to be dedicated as a bechor, firstborn. She'achzo dam. It's sick, it has a fever, it's got some type of chill, something's going on. Afilu hu meis, even if he is about to die, says the Gemara, this is a brisa, says the brisa, ein makizin lo dam jivi Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda wouldn't even allow for akazas dam, wouldn't even allow for bloodletting to save the animal's life. Now, this is not on Shabbos. This is during the week. You can't bloodlet on Shabbos. But we needed to save the animal. The problem with doing bloodletting is that you could make the animal into a blemished animal and give it a mum. That's usser. You're not allowed to make a bechor, an animal that's going to be dedicated to the Beis HaMikdash, to a Kohen. You can't make it into a mum. So even though there's a way to do akazas dam without making a mum, Rabbi Yehuda had a gzeira. You're not allowed to do hakazas dam even in a way that's mutter, out of concern that you may make a mum. A gzeira derabanan. Says the Gemara, v'chachamim omrim yakiz ubilvad shelo yatil b'mum. Do the hakazas dam. You have the latitude. Do the hakazas dam. That's fine. Just don't do it in the way in which there's a mum. Why is he so strict? Why doesn't Rabbi Yehuda say that we can do akazas dam, we can do the bloodletting, save the bechor's life, do it in a way that doesn't give the animal a blemish that will ruin him for the mikdash? All good. So answers the Gemara, and this is psychology note number 2 for the day, and this is used in a halachic frame. And again, this is a stira within Rabbi Yehuda, because this case is very uncommon like the Chadash, yet we see he has a gzeira derabanan. That's the contradiction. Chadash was uncommon, no gzeira. Here, uncommon and a gzeira, that's a stira within Rabbi Yehuda. Answers the Gemara, Hasam, no, what's going on over here with the Bechor? Hasam, and turning to the top of Yad Aleph on base, Hasam, mitoch she'adam bahul al mamono, because a person is so concerned about that which is their finances, therefore, amrinan, we say a psychology. We're concerned, says Rabbi Yehuda, isharisle b'makom she'ein osin bomum. If I give him the latitude to do bloodletting in a way where it doesn't cause for a blemish on the animal, I'm so concerned that he's going to want to save the life of the animal. He's going to dig the needle deeper. He's going to put it somewhere that's going to make the animal a mum. He's going to take it too far. In other words, if I give him a little rope, he's going to take a lot more rope. I'm concerned, says Rabbi Yehuda, that in the case of Bechor, he's going to take it too far and make the animal into a mum because of the psychology. Adam bahul al mamono. He's concerned about the loss of the Bechor. If the animal dies, it's a significant cost. So he doesn't want to lose it. So Rabbi Yehuda says, I'd rather him do nothing than something, because if I give him a little rope, you give a little bit of latitude to the young ones, they run a mile with it. Yes? It's not, you're asking, I was hoping someone would ask this question. It's a great question. It's that's an ant, what? Hoel ubahul hu, ishari, second Rashi.
That's his mouth.
Hold on 1 second. Kaf shin. What is that? Kol shekin. Oh, that's the Rabbanan. That's al mamono. Kohen zeh bahul al habechor shelo yamus. Right. So the Kohen is the one doing the bloodletting. Thank you. So the Kohen's doing the bloodletting.
He's standing with this animal.
Right. So Rabbi Yehuda says he can't do the bloodletting even if the animal's going to die, because we're afraid of. Sorry, thank you for clarifying that. If we give the Kohen the latitude to do a little bit of the bloodletting, we're afraid he may take it too far and make the animal into a mum. So says the Gemara. What about the Rabbanan? The Rabbanan don't agree to this halacha, this psychology that people can take things too far. Say the Rabbanan, yes, but we apply it differently. V'Rabbanan, and this makes so much sense. Kol shekain, all the more so, de'ilo sharis leklal asi lemevad. If we don't give him any latitude, he's going to totally violate halacha and make the animal into a mum. You can't tell him nothing. You can't tell him nothing. So the Rabbanan said, it's basically, which psychology is more true? That if we give some rope, they'll abuse it, or if we give no rope, they'll break halacha. We don't know. That's what the Gemara, that's a machlokes here between the Rabbanan and Rabbi Yehuda. But that's what the Gemara answers, so that it's not a steer in Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda said in the case of bahul al mamono, there he was strict because bahul al mamono, the Kohen might do too much. The Kohen may take things a little too far. And that's therefore why over here we had a gzeira, but by Chadash on the top of Daf Yud Aleph, Amud Aleph, there was no gzeira. Says the Gemara, Umi amrin on the Rabbi Yehuda Adam bahul al mamono. Does he really actually hold of the case of bahul al mamono? Let's see. The Hatnan, we have a Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Rabbi Yehuda says, we'll explain this after we read it. Ein mekadrin habehema b'yom tov. You can't comb a behema an yantif mipnei shu oseh chabura, because it causes for a chabura. Aval mekartzifin, but you can do a different type of combing. What is this talking about? We'll see in a moment. V'chachamim omrim ein mekadrin af ein mekartzifin. You can't do either form of combing. The Tanya ezu kidur ezu kirtzuv. What are these two different types of combing? So it says the Gemara. Here's what they are. Kidur, ktanim, they have very, very fine, it's a very, very fine tooth comb, va'osin chabura. You're trying to get clay, Rashi highlights, you're trying to get some clay off of the animal. So what we're afraid of is that when you take that very, very fine tooth comb, you're going to create for a chabura, which is us, so you're not allowed to do that. However, a Kartsov, Rashi writes that the teeth of the comb are, it's like the Shabbos comb versus the Shabbos brush versus the weekday brush. The teeth are way more spread out. And then Kartsov, gedolim ve'ein osin chabura. So there we see that he doesn't seem to be concerned about bahul al mamono, answers the Gemara, not a stira. Hasam, in the case of the Bechor that we saw in the bottom of the previous Amud, Hasam de ishavikle, if you don't do anything in that case, mayis, the animal's going to die. There we have a real concern about the Kohen of Adam bahul al mamono. However, in this case, there we say Amrinan Adam bahul al mamono, by the case of the Bechor. However, hacha, in the case of the animal that has some clay, some dirt that's caked on, here hacha, ishavi clay, if you don't do anything, tzara be'alma, would be uncomfortable for the animal because it's like stuck to the hair in a funny way that when he moves, it might be a little bit uncomfortable. But lo amrinan adam bahul al mamono, there we would not say it. Yet another question. Rabbi Yehuda, Maishna gabe chametz de gazar. Why is it that in our Mishnah you did have a gzeira? Umaishna gabe kirtzuf de lo gazar. But why, in the case of the wide-toothed comb, why there was that allowed? Answers the Gemara, because lechem belechem nichlaf. It's very easy to mix up two different kinds of bread. Very, very easy. Because again, if your matzah looks like pita bread and you actually have pita bread, very similar, easy to mess up. And what about the other case of the combs? Kidur bekartzof lo mechlav. No one's going to make the mistake between the two different kinds of combs. Again, this is out of our culture. We're not used to this. And we should therefore just accept the Gemara at face value that the two different types of combs were considered significant. We're going to learn the next Mishnah and dig in a little bit into the Gemara. We'll stop at a little bit. We're going to stop 4 lines into the wide lines and then pick up again in Mir Hashem tomorrow night. New Mishnah, but one that we were really just hinting to. Rav Meir Omer, Ochlan kol chamesh v'sorfen b'tchilas sheish, a Mishnah that we saw earlier in the Maseches as well, but this is where its actual location. Rav Meir says, on Erev Pesach on the 14th of Nisan, you're allowed to eat chametz all of the 5th hour. V'sorfen b'tchilas sheish, in the beginning of the 6th hour, you do bir chametz, and then at the end of the 6th hour, that's when the Isser Daraisa kicks in of the Isser of Achilas chametz. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Ochlan kol arba v'tolen kol chamesh. You can eat the whole 4th hour. He adds an hour of the Isser Darabanan. You can eat the whole 4th, but v'tolen kol chamesh. In the 5th hour, you cannot eat like the Tanakama said. There we say tolen, you don't do anything. The Sorfim b'tchilas sheish, they agree that you do your bir chametz at the beginning of the 6th hour, and here too, of course, everyone agrees that at the end of the 6th hour, that's when the Isser Daraisa of chametz kicks in. The Ode, and an amazing historical fact, says the Gemara, says the Mishnah, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Shtei chalos shel toda psulos. There were 2 chalos that were of the chalos of the toda that were pasul. Munachos al gabe ha'itztaba. They were sitting on top of a place that was visible from outside of the mikdash. And here's what would happen: Kol zman shemunachos, as long as both of the loaves were sitting out, kol ha'am ochlin, everyone could eat chametz, no problem. Nitzla achas, when one of the 2 loaves were removed, then everybody knew, everybody chevra, time to stop eating, tolen. This is hour number 5. No one is allowed to eat. Lo ochlin velo sorfen. You don't eat the chametz and you don't burn the chametz. Nitzlu shtehen. Once both of these loaves were removed from the itztaba, they were removed from this space that was viewed by the public. Then what? Says the Gemara, hitchilu kol ha'am sorfen. Then all the bonfires started. Everyone was burning their chametz. Rabbi Gamliel Omer, chulin ne'echalin kol arba. Utruma kol chamesh. Even within Rabbi Yehuda, because we don't want to be soref truma unnecessarily, because we want to eat truma. It's not good to be soref truma. We want to eat the truma. So the Isser Derabanan that Rabbi Yehuda puts into place, that we're told that we don't eat during the 5th hour on Erev Pesach, doesn't apply to truma. You're allowed to eat truma during the 5th hour. The sorfim b'tchilas sheish, then we would burn that if it was chametz in the same way we would do regular b'dikas chametz. Let's just do 5-6 lines very quickly and then we'll stop. Tanan Hassam, the Gemara opens with a sugya that seemingly does not even relate to our Mishnah. We will understand its context tomorrow. We have a Mishnah elsewhere. This Mishnah, where is this elsewhere? This Mishnah is located in Sanhedrin, and this Mishnah is going to talk about edus. Let's say in regards to edus, one person says, Echad Omer, Bishnayim b'chodesh ve'echad omer b'shlosha. One person says the moon presented on day 2. The other one says day 3. Edusan kayemes. We don't consider that conflicting testimonies. Why not? Because shezeh yodeh be'ibur shel chodesh v'zeh eino yodeh be'ibur shel chodesh. One guy knows about ibur chodesh and the other guy doesn't. No problem. That's not considered a conflict of testimony. Because remember that when they grill Eidim, they do so separately in different rooms. Good. Echad omer b'shlosha v'echad omer b'hei. But if the gap in the testimony is I saw X on day 3, and the other one says, no, I saw X on day 5, that gap is too wide, edusan b'tela. First, last of the short lines. Echad omer b'shtei sha'os v'echad omer b'shalosh sha'os. One person says that at the episode that we're giving edus about happened in hour 2. The other one says it happened in hour 3. Edusam kayemes. That's close enough. No problem. However, echad omer b'shalosh v'echad omer b'chamesh. What if there's a 2-hour gap in time between one person's testimony and his friend's testimony? Edusan b'tela divrei Reb Meir. Reb Meir was of the opinion that that is invalid testimony. The conflict between the Eidim ruins their testimony. And Reb Yehuda omer edusan kayemes. He says that the 2-hour gap is okay. Last 2 lines for the night. Echad omer b'chamesh v'echad omer b'sheva. One person says testimony about the 5th hour of the day, and the other one says 7th hour of the day. Edusan b'tela. Their edus is a 0. This has to be only according to Rav Yehuda, who says that the edus is kayam, because otherwise it would have been a puzzle anyways for a 2-hour gap in time. But even according to him, who says 2 hours in time is an okay gap for 2 edim to have, it can't be from the 5th hour to the 7th hour. Why? Because of the sun. Shebechamesh, in the 5th hour of the day, chama b'mizrach. Because in the 5th halachic hour of the day, as the sun rises, hour 5 stops before it peaks, right? Hour 5 is before it peaks, and hour 7 is at the other side of the midpoint of the sky. It's now heading to the west to get closer to setting. So bechamesh chama b'mizrach u'b'sheva chama b'mariv, and the sun is going to be then in the west. And you should have known the difference. And if you don't, again, we're not really so hyper acclimated to these things because we have watches. But back in the day, when they wanted to know when Mincha was, they'd orient themselves. They'd look up and be like, okay, I know approximately which way is which. We're closer to Mincha than we are to Shachris. Or we're closer to dark than we are to Shachris. So therefore, that edus would not be acceptable, even according to Rabbi Yehuda. We'll stop here in Mirtah, and we'll pick up in Mirtah Hashem tomorrow night from Amar Abaye, about 12 lines up from the bottom of Yud Aleph from Mid Beis. Have a beautiful night.